One thing you need before starting out is a water jar. So one water jar can be shared between two students. So just make sure that you have a water cup. You always want to refill that water at the beginning of each period. Make sure there's no funky pigment at the bottom, that it's clearly rinsed and there's no soap bubbles at all. This jar needs to be pure water. Silicoil jars have a coil at the bottom, and that's so that you can knock off pigment gently with your brush and the pigment drifts down to the bottom of the jar. So it makes it so you don't have to get up repeatedly to rinse off your brush. You want to make sure that you're filling up that jar about 3/4 of the way full so that there's about an inch of water above that coil. Inside your box, you should have a palette, and that palette contains 4 colors: yellow, red, blue, and white, which are colors that you cannot get by mixing. So yellow, red, and blue are, of course, the primary colors. Most people think of them as the parent colors because you can mix everything else from those 3. You also cannot mix white. You have to find white out in nature. So you're going to be using a palette knife and you're going to be cutting out, like I just did there, yellow, red, and blue. Now we mix traditionally on the tabletops. Those colors that are on your palette, you want to keep them separate and at all costs prevent them from mixing. Those are what I call mother piles. So you will do all your mixing on the table surface rather than within that circular palette. I'm going to have you guys paint directly on this color wheel. It's a quick one. It's just a review because I know most of you have already done a color wheel successfully in an Art 1 class. Make sure that you put your name up on the top. This is just to check in to make sure you know how to mix all the colors. And we're only using yellow, red, and blue, the 3 primaries. And we're starting off with just those 3. We'll eventually add white to that too. When you're dipping into paint, it's so important that you're only dipping in a little bit. So really you only want the tip of your brush hairs to be immersed in paint, so it looks like this when you view it from the side. So about 1/3 of the brush coated in paint, and that's it. One of the tools that's in your box is a palette knife, and you're lucky because you get to use a metal one, and these are brand new, so you get to have fun with a brand new palette knife. The reason we use palette knives are to save your brush hairs. So your brush is your most valuable tool, and you have 3 to 4 brushes in your box, maybe 5 for some of you. So you want to save those brush hairs. You don't want to bend them, you don't want to overflex them. It's a really good idea to mix with a knife too, because a knife can mix a lot more thoroughly than a brush. The thing about acrylic is you have to do this quickly because acrylics have a really fast drying time. So I will mix up just a few colors at one time, use them, and then move on to the next colors I'm trying to go for. It's very important that you keep your piles clean, which is why I always wipe, like you're seeing there, with a paper towel. So always have a paper towel in the hand that you're not mixing with. Okay, so I'm just going to go right in there for the 3 primaries. I'll start with the yellow. And even if you have a wide brush, if you twist that brush, you can create a curved stroke. If you watch my fingers, I will rotate the brush handle between my 2 fingertips, my thumb, and it's either the middle finger or the index finger, and rotate that brush to kind of swivel. Moving on to the red next. So basically getting in the yellow, the red, the blue, the pure colors that we already have laid out first. And by the way, I assign my brushes a role. So I have a brush that's dedicated to the yellow, I have a brush dedicated to red, and one that's intended only for blue for the time being. There you can see my brushes. So there's a brush with a little bit of yellow, the one with a little bit of red, and just a tiny bit of blue. I'm still using the brush dedicated to the yellows, only I'm using yellow-orange here. And it is okay if you go outside of the lines on this exercise. It's more about color accuracy and making sure you know how to mix your colors. There should be a distinction between the orange and the yellow-orange. So the yellow-orange you should think of like an egg yolk. An orange, you maybe think of like a mandarin. Here's one thing you can do with your brush if you're not using it at the moment. So you can just gently set it inside of your coil jar and just let it sit for a few. You want to avoid letting your brush dry out with paint on it. Alright, so we're going to start mixing the red violets, the violets, and the indigo, so blue-violet. Another option for storing brushes that you're not using is to put them on your easel lip. So every easel has like a little ledge on it, even the tabletop ones do. So if you're not using a brush for a moment, you can just set it there. So I'm still using the red brush on this, so I'm taking my red brush and adding the red violet to it, mixing it up on the palette, on the tabletop, and then applying it. You can see I'm mixing everything on the tabletop and I'm not doing any of the mixing within that circle palette. Okay, so moving on to the blue greens and the greens. Again, using the blue brush here. You're putting aside the red brush and the yellow and only using the blue brush to get those greens. Make sure there is a difference between each one. So the blue green has to look teal, the green in the middle should look kind of emerald, and the one at the end should look very yellow green. Think like slime green. Now we're moving on to making our own black. So you're going to be using yellow, red, and blue, the three primaries to do this. And in the right ratio, you will create a near black. And you're probably wondering, why should we make black when you can purchase a bottle of black? And the reason is this, that most blacks are very flattening, but if you make your own version of black, it will be more rich and interesting and less flat. And it is all about ratio. So I started out with yellow, red, and then added quite a bit of blue. So the more blue there is, you might have to like counter that with red and yellow. Okay, so I'm getting ready to put that black in and I'm applying it, and it actually does look kind of black. It's okay if it leans a little bit purpley or green. In fact, most blacks that you buy, some of them will lean blue or green. You can use that to your advantage if you know color theory. Here is one other way we can test out if our black is a true black. We can add a little bit of white to it, and if it shifts to purple or to green, then we've got to still adjust it. So this is making an actual gray. In fact, grays that you make this way are going to be much stronger, more three-dimensional than grays that you use with black and white. This is your own homemade black plus white to get your own original grays. This gray was like leaning a little lavender, but that's okay. Sometimes you might need that in a certain painting. We have one more ring within that color wheel to complete, and because I'm confident most of you have done a color wheel before, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on how to do a tint. I'll just say it's easier if you actually set up pools of whites on your palette, which is your tabletop, and then bring a dot of the color to those little puddles of white. Because it takes a lot of white to influence a color, you'll be pouring white all day into a color before you get it to shift enough. You want to think of these as pastel colors. So quite a bit of white, just a little smidge of color to influence. This part may seem like the least exciting, but it's actually the most important part of your process, which is making sure that you clean up all your materials. This is something that has to be done daily. You cannot ignore brushes and put them back dirty. You always have to rinse off gently using that kind of coil at the bottom of the jar to knock down the pigment, which is code for paint. And then do that to each brush, wipe it off with a paper towel, then take it over to the sink. Once you're at the sink, you're going to turn on that faucet, but really make sure that you do not turn it on full blast. Just have it going slightly as you rinse your brushes off. You see how I'm pinching the brush hairs? I'm always going with the direction of the hair. And then you have to add soap. So it's water and then soap and then back to rinsing again. On top of our sinks, we have a collection of these little kind of mitts. They're these silicone mitts. They're actually for makeup brushes, but we use them here too to clean off our brush. You take a little bit of that Blue Dawn soap, kind of trickle it on there, and then you gently go back and forth, side to side with your brush, never pushing up because you don't want to push those hairs backwards ever. And you just kind of want to scrub until you see most of the paints, the pigments, like run clean. So you look for clean white soap bubbles instead of like tinted with a color. And then you've got to wash off both that little silicone scrubber mitt thing, and also you have to rinse off your brushes. Take like 10 to 20 seconds on each brush, just rinsing it out and just pinching it. I pinch my brushes at the end of every day and kind of reshape them by like using my fingertips, because you don't want those brush hairs to start to open up. You do get a grade at the end of the semester on how clean your brushes are. If there's a little bit of tint, that's when there's a little bit of color to your brush. That's not a big deal as long as the brush hairs are flexible. Help me out, put those little silicone scrubby thingies back onto the green fake grass stuff so that they can dry. At the end of the day, make sure that shrink wrap on the top of your circular palette is put back into place. You want to have little to no air in there, so it has to be pretty tight, and then I like to wrap it around on the back. The class after you will always tattle on you if you leave a mess at your table. So it's important to take your palette knife, kind of scrape off any excess paint. If there's like kind of like pools of paint, you want to scrape that off first, kind of wipe it on a paper towel as you're seeing here. And then you're going to need to grab a green sponge. I always pre-soak my sponge with a lot of water and then I kind of trickle it onto the table. I like to let it sit for like a minute before I start to scrub because it just loosens up the paint. And you do have to kind of go in circles and like just scrub away until you get most of that material knocked off. If you still have bodies of paint on your tabletop, you can take one of the scraper tools. There are scrapers at every sink. They're like kind of hooked onto the wall. And you want to like scrape off those high, thick areas of paint. They come off pretty easily. It's actually kind of fun to do. You will need a couple things. You'll need that spray bottle and some paper towels. That's why there's paper towel rolls all over the classroom typically. And you're going to be spraying it down last and then kind of wiping it with paper towel. So I'd say that's pretty good. There's a little bit of staining going on, but that actually will scrub off over time. Make sure to put the sponges back. I like to squeegee them out, kind of rinse them too so they're not like loaded with paint for the next unsuspecting person. And then I clip them up to those orange baskets that are at each bank, sink bank. Lastly, you're going to go to the sink and you're going to be dumping your water cup.